Hi, I'm Vishal Kumar from mytakeon.it, and in this video I'm going to take you through the exciting journey of getting started with unit tests for Angular. So if you have never written a unit test in Angular, or even if you have never written unit tests in JavaScript before, this is the video for you. I'll be taking a very step-by-step approach here to ensure that you get a very solid foundation into writing unit tests. So let's start with the tools that I'll be using. We'll obviously need an editor to write our JavaScript code, and then we'll need a test runner to run the tests. Now there are a lot of different options available, but for the purpose of this video I have chosen the Visual Studio editor to write the code, and I'll be using the Chutzpah test runner, which integrates very well with Visual Studio. And then we'll be writing our test in Jasmine. So I have Visual Studio 2013 on my box. On top of Visual Studio, you will need to install Node.js and Chutzpah adapter for Visual Studio and Chutzpah test runner context menu for Visual Studio. So this last option is also very handy when we can really right click on a file and run the tests. So now that all the prerequisites are taken care of, we can start with our first Jasmine test. So even before creating any modules, let's start with a simple test. So I'll create a new JavaScript file. I'll call it first.test.js and write a Jasmine test. The typical syntax is a describe. It's a function which has two parameters. First one is the description, what we're describing, and the second one is the function which contains all the individual tests. So typically here we say what module we are, what is it that we are testing, but right now I'm just gonna say our first test. Within that, within each describe are the tests for that module, and a test looks like this. An it function which has a string where we describe what we're testing, and the second parameter is a function which has the assertions. So in the it, maybe we can test summing of two values. So I can say it should be able to test summing of two values, and we can just say sum equal to 10 plus 20, and then there are different ways of writing assertion statements. I'm gonna use expect sum to equal 30. So that's our assertion. So we are doing an operation and then we assert whether we are getting the required output or not. So here I just right clicked and clicked. Let me do that one more time. Since Chutzpah is integrated with the Visual Studio, I get these two options: run JS tests or open in browser. You can run with coverage, debugger, and everything. So I'm just saying run JS tests, and it's running that one test for this file, and it says 1 passed, 0 failed, 1 total. You can also run it in a browser. You can also run it in a browser. So it will show that one test in green. Now if it is a wrong value, then this test should fail. So saying 0 passed, 1 failed, expected 30 to equal 300. So and this is how, for readability, our statement gets concatenated together. So our first test should be able to test summing of two values. So if you write it the proper way, you'll be able to read it in a proper way as the output. If you write the what you're testing here and then what the test is, that sentence comes together really well. So that's our first unit test in Jasmine. Now that we have written our first test, let's actually write tests for our Angular code. For that, we have to include our Angular files in the project. The .NET way to do it is to include the package for it. So I go to references, say manage NuGet packages, and I'm going to search for Angular. Okay, so here are some results. Angular, this is the main Angular package, so this is what we need. It's installing the latest version, and by installing it will have all these files downloaded under the scripts folder here, and that's the file that we can reference in our HTML files, or in this case our test files. So there you go, all our Angular scripts, they're here now. Angular min. So now let's actually start by writing some Angular code. So we'll start with a very simple controller. Create a new JavaScript file, and I'll call it, maybe we'll use the same summing logic, and we'll create a new controller. We'll call it sum controller JS. Now, typical Angular code, not a whole lot to explain here. Define a module, I'll call it the summing module. No dependencies right now. And then add a controller to it, and the controller is going to be called sum controller. Sorry. Now the dependency for a controller will be only the scope object for now, and we define a function. Just call it sum, which takes two values and returns us the sum of them. Okay, so that's our controller, and we'll see how we will be able to test this controller function using Jasmine. So the first thing we need to do for that is to add our test file. By convention, I like to give the .test extension to it, so I'll just call it sum controller. So test.js, and it's going to be the same describe statement as our first statement, and we are now going to use the convention what we are testing first. So describing, as far as describing goes, we are testing the summing module. Oops. And then inside this we can have all tests for the summing module. Also within the summing module, I want to write tests for my sum controller. So we can have a nested describe, which is a functionality which is good to have. So sum controller is what I want to test, and we'll have it this way, and the test will be right here within this, which should be called, it should be able to return the sum of two values. Okay, so this is the basic framework for our test. Now let's start working on how we'll have everything, all the required dependencies in here to actually create our test. So the very first thing we need to understand is that we are writing unit test right now. Typically, if our controller was defined, the one file that we had created, some controller, if this was included in an HTML page and the page actually uses summing module, if we use that ng app directive to assign it to the page, Angular actually knows how to bootstrap this module into the page. But since we are actually writing the unit tests, we have to do most of these things manually. And so we'll see how we'll do that manually. But even before that, let's actually have all this include files. So in your HTML page you would have included those Angular files. So we have to do the same thing for this test file. And this inclusion works differently for different modules. Different test runners, tools. Karma, using a tool like Karma, you'll probably have a config file where you have all the vendor files, all your source files. But Chutzpah is a lot easier to understand when you're starting out, so that's why I chose this tool. Here, whatever references you need to have, you can actually have it on top of your test. So it's easy to see your dependencies right now. So angular.min.js is something that I need a reference to. An easy way to include the reference file is to just drag that file here, and it will actually create that commented code with the full path to the file. So I'm going to do the same thing for another file that I'll need, which is the Angular mocks file. And I'm going to explain why we'll need that. And most importantly, we need to include the file that we're testing, which is the sum controller file. Okay, so now we have the required references. Now this test knows about Angular. We have included the Angular file. And like I was explaining before, this time we have to manually bootstrap. And for that, we can make use of this Angular mocks that we have already included. This file actually contains modules that can simulate what will actually happen on an HTML page. So these have those mock functions that we can call. So the very first thing is you instantiate the module, and for that here our module is the summing module. So we are using the module function provided by Angular mocks to instantiate that. And the way it works is you just call module and the name of the module, and summing module is the name of our module. And this statement you would want to put it in a before each statement. So that's the third thing I'm introducing about Jasmine, is that we can have a before each statement that you can run, put in here, and that will run before each of the tests are run. So before each module. So again, what we're doing here is we are instantiating that module, the summing module, and we are using a function provided by Angular mocks for that. So now it's almost like you can envision a fake HTML page which actually has the Angular bootstrapped into it. Next step is our sum controller. So now we have the module. The test now understands we have a module, but we still have to create a mock instance of the controller as well. Now in the real HTML page, you know how we use and there is a dependency injection, and there is actually an injector service that finds the controller and runs its constructor function, and that is something we'll do manually as well. And for that we can also use before each again inside the second block. So before each, and again, so now we have to do the same injection. So for that, Angular Mocks has provided us an inject function. So this is how we are gonna simulate the injection of the controller. So we have an inject, and the syntax of inject, the syntax of inject is a function to which you provide the parameters of what you need injected. So in our case, we need the controller, and we also need the scope because we are gonna fire that function against the scope. If you go back and look at the function definition, scope.sum equal to this function. So let's come back here and let's look at what we need. We need the scope and we need the controller. Instead of scope, I'm going to use root scope, and I'm going to explain it just now in a few, but let me put this code in here. So root scope. So injector gives us a way to inject the root scope, and we can create a new scope from that. So that's the typically you write, you get a scope to work with. So we can define this, whatever we are getting back, we can actually assign it to a variable, two variables, so that we can use it. So we'll define scope and controller. Now scope, like I said, we can use, we don't have ability to inject the scope, but we have the ability to inject a root scope. So we can make use of the root scope itself to create a local scope instance. So we can use the $new of this root scope. So that gives us a scope. Now all we need is using this controller, we can now create a controller instance. So let's call a controller, create the controller, and we have to give the name of the controller, which will be some controller, and then we pass in the parameters that it will need. So we are, instead of the automatic dependency injection, we are manually providing it how each of its constructor parameters should be instantiated. In this case, $scope. So we'll tell it, hey, your $scope, for that use this value, which we have already instantiated. So now we have a good instance of controller to work with. So the next thing, now that we have the controller and it's in the before each, so you can write a number of tests below that can use this controller. And our test, as usual, will be very simple. We'll do result equal to scope dot sum. So we'll call the sum on the scope, and again, for consistency, I'm going to use the same values we used before, 10 and 20, and we have the assertion to test whether we succeeded or not. So result dot to equal 30. Now let's run this. I right click and say run JS tests, and it says 1 pass, 0 fail. So we are able to create our very first test for our Angular code using Jasmine. Important points to look at here. We are taking full advantage of Angular mocks here to sort of simulate what actually happens in a real page. We call it the module function. Then We use its inject function to get a root scope and a controller injected here, and this $controller we can use to create a controller instance with a given name, and to that we provide a scope. The scope is something that we can create from the root scope that is available through the Angular mocks. So we can just create a new scope out of that, and that will be part of our controller, the controller $scope value, which actually is injected and created directly by the injector service on a page. We are actually manually assigning it here. So once you have the controller and the scope value, and they are defined as variables, these variables are defined outside the before each, so I have a handle of it to it all the time. And then we have the test, which has the result and which has the assertion to test if the value is working or not. So that's our first introduction to writing tests for your Angular code. Hope this helps.